Hi everyone, I'm going to be discussing today chapter 4 of Johnson's book, and he titled it Seeing Yourself. First, I want to discuss how he introduced this specific chapter. I think it was a really interesting way to introduce it. He discussed two specific people. You have a BCBA, and also a therapist or psychologist who works in the same office, and they both understand that neither one understands each other's thing, and they respect that. But it goes with an interesting dilemma at the very end where it talks about the inner self and how we need to take into account our inner selves as well. So after he introduces this topic, he goes on with the first heading of learning to talk about ourselves. This is where everything in all of my understanding of this chapter is based off of. We have a verbal community, who do you think you are, and perception, awareness, attention, and consciousness. So all three of these sections are really interesting. In the beginning with the verbal community, it says that we develop as people based on our own verbal communities. We develop our inner selves based on this verbal community. If we didn't have a verbal community, then our inner self would not be there. Our inner selves would not be there. He uses the word I a lot in there, like I'm going to drive to the store, or I like the way I look today, versus saying Melissa got in the car and drove to the store. It's very inwards versus being very blunt outwards. In the section of who do you think you are, this is where it talks about seeing and questioning ourselves, specifically with how we are viewing ourselves in our position in the world. In the last section, we have perception, awareness, attention, and consciousness. This I found to be pretty interesting. It talks about how, because of the verbal community, we develop slowly more and more specific awareness to what is going on around us, and we're able to describe it more. So I can say dog, and then as I get older, I have a dog, or I like a dog, and then keep going up, I own a black dog. So it's just building upon what I already have as my verbal community. In the next section where it says behavior of seeing, this is really a good portion of this chapter that I found that discusses seeing, because if we don't have that seeing aspect down, then from my understanding, Johnson's kind of saying then we wouldn't have our verbal community, or we wouldn't be able to have the perception of ourselves. And so he starts off with the role of reinforcement history. This is basically discussing our senses and how we interact with those senses. It's how we see, quotation marks, see the world around us. So I can say, I saw a note card on the table, instead of saying, I see my note card and a bunch of papers and a bunch of other things. We're specifically trained to see that note card. Our learning history helps us with that. And so does the behavioral needs. So if I need that note card, that's where my eye is going to go in particular. The next section in here is the seeing that you are seeing. It's where we respond to our own verbal stimulus around us. So I see a dog coming at me. I'm going to squat down and pet my dog who is running at me, kind of deal. We're engaged and we're aware of what's going on around us. We're not just kind of standing there not doing anything. This is a huge part of seeing. His example in here that I really liked was the dog, where he talks about the dog learning to chase a squirrel. There's other things going on around us, but that dog is getting that squirrel because that is what it's learned to go do. In the next section, he talks about managing our behaviors. Obviously, as we're going on and learning about ABA, we're learning everything has the ABCs, the antecedent, consequence, and antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So mimicking our behaviors, we have an antecedent and then we have a consequence afterwards. So our antecedent is going to be, based on this chapter, what we see, and that is going to develop what our behavior is and then what the consequence is after. So in this section right down here, he has several different parts in there. He has changes in stimuli, manipulative deprivation conditions, manipulating emotional variables, adverse stimulation, and basically drugs or other substance abuse. So let's start off with the first section. It says changes in stimuli. This is where we are going to remove stuff or change our environment so that we don't go in there. His example is take cookies off the counter so we don't constantly eat them. Manipulative deprivation conditions. This is where we make our behaviors what we want them to be. So example, if I'm going to go eat Thanksgiving dinner and I know it's going to be about 1 o'clock, I'm probably not going to eat lunch and I'm probably not going to eat dinner afterwards because I'm going to eat a lot there. Having our emotion tied to our behaviors. This is where I'm going to hold my tongue so I don't create issues or, kind of hold back from doing things. With the aversive stimulation to control everything, this is where we scold ourselves or we give ourselves punishment for things. And the last one is drugs or other substance that modifies the effects. So basically saying to make us enjoy something more, we might be taking this that is going to control our behaviors. But all of this is coming from the internal quotation mark self. Or it's not coming from the internal self, but rather our reinforcements that we are putting on ourselves. The last section is the self-reinforcement. This was kind of tricky, I found, because from my understandings, he's saying that there is no such thing as self-reinforcement. There's contingencies and there's reinforcement, but there is no such thing specifically as self-reinforcement. It talks about how a person who is going to study 2 hours a night for a very long exam that they might have, and afterwards they're going to give themselves a beer. That's not self-reinforcement. The reinforcement contingency is already there. It's more or less you're building this process to be able to receive that. It's as he says in here, and this is kind of where I found it interesting and tricky. The beer is always going to be in the fridge. So many would see the beer as a reinforcer of studying, and because Matt is the one setting up the contingency, it would seem to be self-reinforcement, assuming it all works out and drinking the beer makes the likelihood of studying under such conditions for the future. But Matt hopes that this will affect him to study more by building that beer contingency in there. It's not actually reinforcing anything because the beer's there, the fridge is always there, he needs to study, it's just he's putting that contingency in place for himself. I found this chapter to really be eye-opening. I never really thought that the inner self was not truly a thing until after reading this specific chapter, and then that's when I started to look more and dive and say, yeah, I believe it. I believe that there's no inner self. I believe that our verbal communities develop a lot of things. Just working with children that I work with and looking back at my own verbal community, completely different saying things than what they say nowadays. They see things completely different than the way that I would see things. So it's a really interesting point of view that I'm acquiring from reading Johnson. So my question that I'm posing to you is, Johnson mentions that our seeing is based upon that verbal community that we develop. Do you believe this? If so, I would love for you guys to explain your thinking and give specific examples about it and how it helps you to develop your own thinking. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.